when we look at the history of Marxism in relation to decline, the history follows the overall history of Marxism itself. Stalinism, quite obviously, took the concept of decline and virtually ruined it, for which reason most Marxists, as far as I can see, abandoned it. Because basically what Stalinism was saying was the Soviet Union was wonderful and the rest of the world was in decline, standard of living was going down everywhere else, and so on, which was simply untrue. Their conception was so limited that very few people could actually accept it. And I think for that reason it was abandoned, as far as I can see. Of course, it wouldn't have been true of those who were not Stalinist automatically, but I think most have more or less fallen in with it. So that the very term decline, when one speaks to people, or used to, this is no longer the case since the downturn in fact. But most Marxists more or less turned down the conception because it appeared to be patently untrue. It is, of course, patently untrue if you use the Stalinist conception of absolute decline and degeneration. For the same reason, those people who appear to accept it didn't actually use the word decline. So if you think of Mandel, the term he used for his major work was, if you remember, late capitalism. And he doesn't really go into a theory of decline, but it's implicit in the book. It's quite clear. But he doesn't really go into any kind of theory of decline, though it is implicit in it. But that's what you expect from Mandel, because Mandel, A, never finished his thoughts, one can quite easily see, and was also ambiguous on every subject. So he could never be accused of a theory of decline when people were against it, since he didn't use the word decline. On the other hand, he was loyal to the overall tradition of Marxism. Again, the other big influence within Marxist political economy, of course, has been the monetary review school. So if you look at Monopoly Capital, which played such a big intellectual role in the 60s, we'll see again the word decline is not used, but many of those chapters are describing decline. Again, there's not much of a theory of it, and some of it one wonders how on earth Sweezy could have actually written it when he describes decline, for instance, being given by example on the number of theses written, PhD theses written in America on trivial subjects. He took the example of the number of birds killed on some road somewhere in the middle of nowhere. No doubt the person got an excellent PhD, which was his point. So it was, in a sense, trivialized, but nonetheless it's very much there. It's very much part of the history of Marxism. If one thinks of the two major theorists who had such an enormous influence within Marxist political economy. Of course, if one goes further back, the conception of decline is not in Marx as decline of capitalism. As far as I can see, maybe somebody has found it. I've tried looking where one might find it, tried using an index, and tried using whatever there is. As far as I can see, Marx never does discuss the question of the decline of capitalism, which, if you think about it, is slightly odd, because after all, Lenin, whom I'll discuss, does of course date the decline from 1870. On the other hand, Capital, of course, Volume 1 came out in 1867. Marx does refer to capitalism being senile, just in one sentence when he's talking of the falling rate of profit. But that's just at one point, and he doesn't follow it up. He doesn't really introduce it. It's just almost a throwaway line. So I think it's pretty clear that Marx was engaged with trying to discuss capitalism in its maturity, the way capitalism actually functions, the way the laws of capitalism actually function, rather than the way it was or could be, in decline. Again, he does discuss the coming into being of capitalism, but he doesn't discuss the ending of capitalism or the forms of decline. If one looks at the later Marxists, it's Lenin who introduces the concept. There isn't anybody else who uses the word decline as far as I can see. It's Lenin. And it's Lenin alone as far as I can see. Again, it's not a question of it being totally absent. If you look at Hilferding's work, Finance Capital, written in 1910, you'll see simply by looking right at the end, the last paragraph, that's implicit. It's implicit in what he's saying, that he thinks finance capital is part of the decline of capitalism, but he doesn't actually use the words. Perhaps he didn't want to go that far, but it's clearly implicit. But it's only Lenin in 1917 who actually brings out the concept and tries to actually theorize it. After he does that, of course, it becomes the line of the Bolshevik Party, and it is accepted by Trotsky. So again, he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about decline. But if you look at Trotsky's introduction to Otto Ruler's extracts from Capital in the Fawcett edition, if anybody's seen it, 1937, I think it is. Otto Ruler, who, if you remember, was one of the two social democrats who voted against the war credits in 1914, and was in exile in Mexico with Trotsky, and apparently used to have dinner with Trotsky every Friday night. Put together this collection of extracts from Volume 1 of Capital as a kind of introduction to Capital itself. And Trotsky writes the introduction. Probably nobody has seen it. Well, the point of it is, if you actually look at it, Trotsky is describing the Great Depression, which of course is kind of introduction to what I'll say tomorrow. But he's describing the Great Depression, but he describes it in apocalyptic terms. At the time, it wouldn't have hit anybody as saying anything different, as it were. But if you read it, as I did in the 60s, it looked completely out of place, because it was saying that capitalism was in absolute decline, the law of increasing misery was clearly correct, people had been opposing it, but it was clearly right, standard of living was going down, that was the nature of capitalism. So, of course, his argument wasn't quite as simple as might flow from that, but it was quite detailed in his argument that capitalism was coming to its end. But that's not quite the same thing as decline, or to have a theory of decline. So it's really only Lenin who actually puts it forward, as far as I can see. Although, as I say, I think it's implicit in a number of writers, and in a sense it's implicit in Marx. In what sense is it implicit in Marx? Marx, if you remember, I think it's in one of the prefaces, cites a Russian reviewer who talks of what Marx's method is as being the method of looking at society and its coming to being, its maturity, and its end. The word decline is not used there. And then Marx says, well, that is my method. He has got it absolutely right. That is what I was writing, the dialectic method. But of course, the dialectic method does talk of a decline. You expect there to be decline. There can't be a coming into being, maturity, and no decline, just sudden death, as it were. So it clearly is implicit in Marx's works if one looks at the whole concept of an entity coming into being. It must have a decline too, because what he's doing is taking in effect from Greek philosophy, and he explicitly does discuss coming into being, maturity and decline in 1840. So obviously he's very well aware of it, but he doesn't actually apply it at the time. Although he does use the word decline in relation to feudalism, So he's well aware of the concept of decline, but he isn't actually applying it to capitalism, except in the one instance which I actually quoted. Obviously, the dialectic implies a decline. You can't simply have a society which suddenly, at maturity, suddenly ceases. It doesn't make any sense. The analogy has always been an organic one. That's to say, looking at any organic entity as to what actually happens to it, like a human being coming into being, maturing, declining in old age and dying. So that comparison has been standard and was clearly within Marx as an integral part of his method, of the dialectic method. So one would expect, therefore, any Marxist to have a theory of decline, as it were. Nonetheless, the only person who actually puts it forward in his history, in the history down to 1920, is actually Lenin. As I say, I think it was probably, well, it is implicit in the writing before then, but it hadn't actually been theorized. So we're really talking of Lenin alone, who does try to theorize it for the time. What he doesn't do, though, is try and have a general theory of decline. That's the overall history of the economy of the concept, which is implied in the title of the talk. And this is where the introduction. So, if we're actually going to look at decline, obviously, have to ask what one's actually looking at. And for any Marxist who are looking at society, what you look at first and foremost is the form of the surplus product. Again, it's Marx who makes that point, that it is the extraction of the surplus product which gives the key to the nature of the society. And it's therefore the form of the surplus product which is crucial for us to understand. And therefore any decline must be a decline of that form, not just of the surplus product, but of the form of the surplus product. It must be changing. Now, of course, again, within capitalism, the form of the surplus product is surplus value. It's the value form, so it's surplus value. So therefore, the conclusion would have to be that the decline would have to be the decline of value itself, and so of value itself, in order to understand the decline of surplus value. That's an automatic conclusion. There is no, I don't think there's any way out of that. It's the changing in the form of value, the changing really of the nature of the surplus product. So one's then involved in discussing the laws involving the value and the way they are changing. As far as I'm concerned, a law is a description of the process of movement of the contradictions within the system. Law isn't usually defined within Marxism, but it seems to me we have no choice. We have to define it, and that's why I am defining it. So you can put together what the law of value therefore is. It is describing the process of the contradiction between use value and exchange value within capitalism, and between abstract labour and concrete labour. So what we would have to do is to look at the way that is changing, has been changing over time. It's changing in the period of decline. It appears to me that is the way one would have to go about it. If I were to do it in full, I'd probably be here until the next conference, which one's really talking about the history of capitalism and its change at the present time. So, I can't pretend that I know enough to last till next year, or even until tomorrow. So I can only say what I think I've managed to think up. The first qualification one has to make, it's not really a qualification, is that when one looks at many Marxists, they confuse terminal crisis and decline. in principle you can have decline for hundreds of years, or if you want, in discussing with Mike, he's putting forward the conception of a block transition, which, in the case of Islam, which seemed to last over 1,000 years. It's certainly true of Byzantium. So, in principle, one could have a decline lasting a very long time. A terminal crisis is entirely different. A terminal crisis is what it says. It's the coming to an end of the system. It's the crisis system, and it's coming to an end, finished, goodbye. Now, that conception is what underlies many people's objection to the term of decline. It also underlies the conception of many people who don't reject the concept of decline, but don't understand it, of course. Just as an aside, last year, when I was arguing that there are not many Marxist historians, because it's very difficult to be a Marxist historian as opposed to a historian. I'm not trying to argue that historians are not Marxist historians are not worth reading. I'm simply saying there's a difference between Marxist historians and historians. A Marxist historian would have to look at history in terms of the movement of the laws of this system, or if you want, the laws of motion of the system. Words which, of course, Marx used, but he actually was simply repeating words which had been used much earlier. The laws of motion of the system. Something which I was surprised to discover myself, but he did. It was part of the nature of the coming to be of political economy that the concept of laws and the laws of motion of the system were very much the essence of what it was to be a political economist. And Marx simply picked that up. So one might have thought that if there was anybody continuing the original conception, they would continue with the idea of looking at the laws of motion and the way they were changing. But of course, there isn't anybody who is not a Marxist. Well, the point here being that last time when I made that statement, that as far as I could see, most of the so-called Marxist historians were historians, but not Marxist historians, because they weren't looking at the change in the laws of the system. They weren't even looking at the laws of the system. They weren't even looking at the question of a form of the surplus product or surplus value. They deliberately avoided it. It's obviously true of Perry Anderson, Eric Hobsbawm, whom I don't have much in common with, but Eric Hobsbawm makes exactly that point in reviewing Perry Anderson's work. But last time somebody brought up Chris Wickham as an historian who was Marxist. So unfortunately I went and bought one of his books to see where his contribution lay, and I was simply amazed. The book was unreadable. It was a collection of facts that, as far as I can see, there's no point in reading. I mean, it's an excellent dictionary. One should have it on one's wall. Or if you want to be a masochist, you can just go through it. Whilst if you've got an excellent memory, then I think you should go through it. But it's very difficult to read unless you do have that kind of memory. It clearly isn't Marxist in that. And what really surprised me is he actually used the word decline at one point and says the Roman Empire was not in decline. Well, of course, that of course isn't the traditional Marxist interpretation, but he's actually saying that in 400 AD it was not in decline, when it was about to come to an end. What he really means is that it wasn't in a terminal crisis. He doesn't mean decline. He doesn't know what the word decline means, as far as I can see. What he's saying is that if not for the external force, the Roman Empire would not have come to an end, which of course is true at that point. But clearly it doesn't use the word decline, doesn't think what it actually means. And I'm not clear whether he thinks he's a Marxist or not. He may well be one, but he certainly hasn't written a Marxist work. Anyway, the point which I've belabored here is simply that decline is not the end. It's a process of change. And what follows from that as well is not only that it can last a long time, but that it must have specific forms of its own. If one wants, there are laws of decline, effectively, which will alter the nature of the surplus product. Surplus value continues, but it's altered in its form. Now, the obvious form you can see, which is different, is finance capital. That's an immediate thing. It's not the only one, but it's the immediate one which is in everybody's minds today. The growth of finance capital is an independent entity, as opposed to money or banks, because if you look at chapter 3, volume 3 of Capital, you'll see that marked there. Talks of banks and banking money as being the height of capitalism itself, which of course makes sense, because the next step would be finance capital, where, as it were, falls or rises higher, but not within a vibrant capitalism. So, what I've just argued is that there are laws, effectively, of the different aspects, periods of any entity of its own kind. I don't know whether one can say these laws are subservient to the fundamental laws of capitalism or not, and exactly how they relate. But it seems to me that there are specific laws of the particular stage of capitalism. That's to say, of the embryonic phase, the mature phase, and the declining phase. So within the declining phase, what we have to look at, therefore, is the specific forms, specific laws which actually exist. The result, of course, is that it becomes highly complex to try to understand our society. Whereas one could look at a classical capitalism and talk of it in terms of the law of value and the way it operates. When looking at modern capitalism, we have to say, well, we have the law of value, but we also have the aspects of it of decline, laws of decline, which affect the law of value. And thirdly, to come to the next point, is the question of transition. One doesn't have, in fact, early capitalism, or an early society, a mature society, a declining society, and then a neat transition, and then the next society. The transition takes place in part in the decline itself. The transition effectively embraces both the decline and the coming into being of the new society. So that, as you all know, Marx puts it, the new society comes into being within the womb of the old society. But of course, the way it does that is different in every change of society. That's to say, it's different in the case of the movement from feudalism to capitalism, from the movement in the movement from capitalism to socialism. But what it means is that within the decline which we're going through, we're also going through a transition away from capitalism to socialism. It doesn't mean to say that any entities which now exist are socialist, but they are proto-forms, which may be horrible, but they are proto-forms in existence today of what will come into being, which are not classical capitalism, most obviously being nationalized property, centralized nationalized property. We know the nationalized forms, the centralized forms which actually exist are very often anti-working class, and the particular centralized nationalized form of the Soviet Union was inhuman. But that doesn't alter the fact that it's still part of a transition. So when looking therefore at the nature of society, we are compelled to look at the laws of decline, the laws of transition, and the laws of capitalism. That's the way it seems to me. That makes it very difficult to understand where we are. Now, that's different from the classical Marxist statement, which basically is that we are looking at a society of exploitation where a worker sells his or her labour power to the capitalist, who then receives surplus value. That value itself goes back to abstract labour, and the contradiction between abstract labour and concrete labour. Now, that, however difficult it might be for some people to grasp it, many people grasp it, it is relatively simple. But when you add what I'm just saying, it becomes complex and difficult to understand our society. The importance of that, you can see, is that the fundamental ideology of capitalism is not nationalism, as some people want it to be, but commodity fetishism. It's commodity fetishism which maintains the ideology of capitalism, and it does more than that because it is real. So it is a fundamental force maintaining the stability of capitalism. So, but once it is exposed, workers are fighting against it and achieve some measure of success. It's effectively hold below the water. It's difficult for people who understand, and many people do, probably most people understand, that they are being exploited today. Capitalism has to resort to other features in order to maintain its ideology and to maintain its form of control. That's not the whole form of control, of course. The reserve army of labour is also crucial. Point being, therefore, that whereas one would have thought in an earlier period that once commodity fetishism was exposed or limited or whatever, workers were able to organise, they would understand the nature of their exploitation and successfully overthrow it in a relatively easier way. At the present time, it's very difficult to understand where we are. It's very difficult to understand what society is and where it is going. And it's not just because of commodity fetishism, which I'm just implying doesn't play the same role. It is because society is in fact complex. It is hard to understand it. It's hard for a Marxist to understand it, as a Marxist. And I think it's hard for anybody to understand it. And of course, deliberately society is seeing to that nobody does analyse it in the way I'm just talking about it. Trying to really understand the forces at work and the forces of change. So, unlike, as it were, the earlier period when it appeared much easier to expose the nature of capitalism, the task you face is in fact harder at that particular level. I don't think that's any great surprise, as it were, since it's obvious the left hasn't got anywhere. But I'm giving it a pretty good excuse, I think. At one level, of course, insofar as there is in this process of transition a failure, as in the case of Stalinism, it becomes almost impossible to find a way out, as it were, to explain to the population what Stalinism actually is, was, or would be, and that it isn't a necessary feature of a movement to socialism. But that seems to me the kind of thing one would expect in any long drawn-out transition, which is what we're talking about. It's at least 100 years now, since nearly 100 years since 1917. Of course, what I've been talking about is the objective forms of change, and what I've just referred to now is a subjective form where the proletariat did take power. Decline has to be associated with the subjective as well, subjective change. It's Trotsky who put forward this conception of a transition. What he explicitly says is that once the Social Democrats refused to take power, let's say socialists, it ushered in a period of transition, which I think is basically correct. The point being that they'd seized power in 1917, but they could go no further. So what one was left with was both an objective transition and a subjective one. If one looks at decline and its movement, one aspect of the transition and the decline in going to socialism is that the closer you go to socialism, the more subjective the movements within capitalism become, or within the entity which is changing becomes, which is what you would expect, because within socialism, the aim is to subject the society to planning, to conscious planning by the associated producers, to quote Marx. In other words, it becomes increasingly subjective. It becomes increasingly possible for mankind to understand itself and to understand how to run the society and not simply accept the market as a permanent feature, or any aspect of society is simply permanent, but to find a way to control it, harness it, and so on, and ultimately to control nature. There is a total conflict with the Greens. The aim in the end is to control nature instead of to be subject to nature. Remember, Marx in the Grundrisse makes precisely that point in relation to the pre-class society, where he says basically, well, they are in some sense free, on the other hand they are subject to nature, and he compares it to the society of ants, who in some sense are free but are completely controlled. So the aim in taking power in socialism isn't just to end capitalism, is of course to bring to an end the whole period of class subjection, and also the period before class subjection, where the subjective becomes primary, as it were, in the objective. So as one moves towards socialism, within the decline itself and the transition, you would expect that as the laws evolve, that the subjective will become more and more important. And to jump the issue, as it were, for tomorrow, I think that's true as well if we look at the causes of the crisis. You can't simply talk of the usual forms of crisis being simply objective, simply it happened. Okay. Next point I'd like to make is this, that a declining capitalism is a capitalism in which any entity, any social entity, would be an entity in which the mediations become increasingly difficult to find. In fact, that would be the primary definition of it from what I'm arguing, that it's increasingly difficult for capitalism to find mediations in order to maintain the system. It's not simply that the system would come to an end, but the mediations which it's finding are antithetical or antagonistic to capitalism itself, or different from what capitalists want or need. To illustrate that, it's obviously true that a capitalist firm has to plan. One might say it has to organize, and that's not quite planning. But of course, that's again in chapter 1 of Capital, where he makes this point that there's this great distinction between what the capitalist does inside his firm and what is between the firms, that you have the market which is unplanned. But of course, what is actually happening, what has happened to capitalism, is both that the firms are very much bigger, you have monopolies in spite of the competition commissions and all the rest of them, as compared to earlier capitalism, we have a monopoly for. In spite of Margaret Thatcher talking of thousands of small firms and present-day capitalism going on and on about the fact that employment is given by all these small firms of 3 or 4 people, or maybe 10 people, or 20 people, or whatever, it simply avoids the question, because insofar as you have small firms, they are usually controlled by the big firms. What's crucial is, in fact, the big firms. If you just think of the supermarkets, Tesco controls thousands of firms, in fact. Or you think of the car firms, that this same is true. So we're in a capitalism which is controlled to a much higher degree, and in which they have to plan, using the word plan in inverted commas. Now that isn't, as it were, the preferred mode of action of capital. But there is no other way to actually do it. And what has been happening, of course, is that the so-called planning isn't just for 6 months, a year, or whatever. If they're going to introduce anything new, whether it's a new model of car or new machinery or whatever, it usually has to be brought in and planned over a number of years. Very often the research involved will take years and years, and the actual putting the new entity into the factory or whatever it is takes many more years. So it's a long period in which there's no alternative but to think the whole thing out and in fact to plan it. Creating, as it were, the proto-forms of what a social society would itself do. The problem for a capitalist is, of course, it means he has to tie up his money for this whole period. The risk to him is absolutely enormous from his point of view. And of course, modern economics talks only of risk. So one's talking of it being more planned or planned to a much higher degree. And of course, it's not just within the firm, it's society as a whole. Very obviously, the Bank of England plays a crucial role, and we've seen the different forms in which society as a whole has necessarily to control the economy, something which again the capitalist class finds, although it accommodates to it, and antagonistic. It's not an accident that one had Thatcher and we have today the present Conservative government trying to roll history back, because from their point of view that is really the only alternative. So what one has is a form which is increasingly socialized in that it's planned, it's long term, it's increasingly costly because they have to go in for research and development, and the actual equipment becomes increasingly costly, increasingly complex. In other words, the organic composition of capital rises. And of course, it extends to the whole society, not just the individual firm. So we're talking of enormous amounts going into infrastructure development, which is now regarded as a crucial way of saving the economy, except that they're not actually doing it. But the internet is another example of it, the increasing integration of the economy or of society or the world economy, which again is what one would expect as one approaches socialism anyway. What goes along with that, of course, is increased bureaucracy, managerialism. Every time they try to introduce the market into certain sectors, you have more and more managers. That's why they've got 40,000 managers in the NHS. It isn't just because they like managers, it's because if they introduce the market, they have to have managers to have the targets. And of course, once you have a layer of managers, they need another layer of managers, and that just increases. So you have enormous levels of management. So, but it's a necessary feature, effectively, of its decline. Whereas in classical capitalism, you have the capitalist and the worker. Here you have somewhere a capitalist and layers of management, and then you have the worker. And those managers are simply absorbing surplus value. In the recent period, what you've had, of course, is a merger, really, of upper management with the capitalist class, deliberate absorption of this layer. So what I've just done is just give a number of aspects in which the economy is increasingly socialized, which indicate the way in which a society is actually moving. One aspect of it, of course, is that there are a number of features of the society which are needs-based and have to be needs-based, like the NHS, health, social work, education. And again, the more complex society and the more it moves towards a social society, the more important would the human aspects be. That's the more important health, dealing with health. It's become quite obvious now that, say, if you assume society would keep going up in productivity over time, the length of time people would live would be very much greater than it is today. In fact, it's just unfortunate we are living today about 100 years' time. From that point of view, then we could live through, well, whatever period, 150, 200 years, or maybe longer. But that's the way society is clearly moving. But that's needs-based. And when they attempt to control it in the United States, what you get is a total mess and enormously costly within society. As we know, in the United States, expenditure on health is 18% of the GDP. In Britain, it's below 9%. It's slightly below the average in Europe. That's using the administration as opposed to insurance companies. Quite obviously, the insurance company, the value form, is a negative feature at the present time. It's showing itself as being negative, which it's very obvious in the United States to people in the United States and to anybody else in the world. In fact, the use of insurance companies, again, is a social form itself. It's a socialized form, but it is some kind of a compromise, which clearly doesn't work. From the point of view of capital, I say these sectors are needs-based. You can go through a number of them. And what it means is that they don't create surplus value. So an increasing part of the surplus product or surplus value is absorbed by sectors like this, which are basically needs-based. But it's not just that. One can talk of finance capital, where over 1 million people in this country work in finance capital. You can talk about advertising. You can talk about the retail sector. In fact, I have in front of me the workforce jobs by industry. And there's something like 30 million people in Britain employed. I think something like half are in the unproductive sector. They don't actually produce surplus value. Remember, exchange does not produce surplus value. And any sector which is not based on profit doesn't produce surplus value, like education or health in Britain. So if we just go through these figures, you can see very obviously why that is the case, although it's somewhat more complex. But there's 4 million people involved in health and social work in Great Britain. It's 4 million out of 30 million. The retail sector takes 5 million. But even if you reduce the numbers involved in those sectors for numbers of people who will be doing something which might be productive, you still end up with a high proportion of the modern workforce effectively being supported out of value coming from the productive sector. And you would expect that to increase over time. That certainly creates a problem for Marxist theorists in terms of the nature of the downturn, the nature of falling rate of profit and so forth, because the implication is that, of course, all comes from surplus value. But anyway, from the point of decline, what we're showing is how wealthy the society is, how it is possible for the modern society to change itself to become a human society rather than a market society that is moving in that direction, that it's there effectively. It's possible, and in certain senses it's moving in any case. That's more or less the way it is effectively going. So what I've just been saying is that the mediation has become increasingly difficult, but it doesn't mean that there aren't mediations. It's just that the mediations themselves begin to change the society. And the capitalist class, as a class, not individually, find it difficult to cope with it. And it has an overall effect. Of course, there are a number of other mediations which are mentioned often, which I'll talk about tomorrow. Very obviously, the major way in which capitalism maintained itself, ways of imperialism and war. And it's increasingly difficult for them to simply go to war on the scale that they have in the past. You can see the present war isn't having anywhere near the effect that the last war did. It's much smaller. And it's very difficult for them to go for another war. I would think a war is now ruled out for the next, whatever it is, 20 years. Probably just simply ruled out, full stop. But imperialism, although it clearly continues, isn't what it was. The rate of profit from that that is derived from imperialism is much more limited. So one's talking of these mediations which were barbaric but essential to the continuation of capitalism. Themselves indicating the difficulty capitalism was having, that it had to go outside the system, as it were, go to war and have an imperialist fall. I don't think I need to go into it again because this has been said many times, and I'll be going into it at some level tomorrow. So what I've been arguing also is that the law of value itself is in decline. Well, clearly what you've got is a substantial proportion of people who effectively are working not quite in the law of value. They're not producing surplus value that is obvious. Money itself is nationalized. It's not gold. Gold price has gone through the roof, as you know. But world money, in fact, in Marxist sense, doesn't exist. What you've got is a nationalized form of money. We have monopoly prices. It's not the prices in general are some division or multiplication of value. Because there are a small number of firms basically in the end controlling the economy, that becomes the form. The idea that you have a large number of firms competing with one another, so reducing the price to value, is simply not true today. So I've pointed out also that the government plays a crucial role within society. So we'll have to conclude, when we add together the increasing share of the unproductive sector, the role of government, the importance of planning, the importance of monopoly, the nationalized forms, particularly of money, that one's saying the law of value itself is clearly in decline. The third aspect, because I've been saying, is the law of value is in decline. It's increasingly difficult to find mediations. And thirdly, it's a question of productivity. Mike rightly pointed to the importance of it in the nature of capitalism. And Marx makes it very explicit that that is the function of capitalism. It's unfortunate that humanity had to go through this period of capitalism, but it had to, in order to raise the surplus product. He's very explicit about that. The logic of that is that capitalism will go on raising productivity to its end because it has to. That is the nature, if it is to be capitalism. Even though one has increasing monopoly, it's not total monopoly, and the word monopoly in Marxist language implies a level of competition, a much smaller level than in the usual competitive society, but a very limited form of competition, and that does assist in raising productivity. It's the nature of capitalism that it has to raise productivity. However, it's not raising it as fast as it could. One would argue that a social society would raise it faster for a time, after which it would stop doing it in the same way, or to the same extent, until all mankind, in fact, would have a reasonable standard of living. But the crucial point is that the increases in the level of productivity are clearly below what a social society could do. And more than that, the nature of what is produced is different. That's to say, society could produce items for humanity which humanity needs as opposed to what it is producing. Just think of all the war goods that are involved, the enormous amount that's spent on war. Complete waste. You just go through the different aspects of society which are either not needed or not needed now, or are being introduced now when one could do something else quite different to raise the standard of living, to raise the position of most people in the world who are on the breadline or dying. It's clear that capitalism could do it, but in principle, but it can't do it. That's to say, only a social society could actually do it. So in other words, the growth in productivity continues. The idea that a decline simply involves the end of growth is nonsense. But the productivity growth is lower than its potential in a social society. It remains the nature of capitalism to increase productivity, but it's and there probably will never be a period when there is no innovation. Now, if you remember, Lenin makes the point, rather oddly, but as an illustration of this overall point, that the light bulb hadn't been changed for many years and they could produce a much better light bulb, which we are now getting, or whatever. But it's taken them a long time to actually get here. I don't know if it's a wonderful example. I've taken that from Lenin, but it's just, since it's Lenin who puts forward the overall theory which in these terms. So the second aspect which I've just said is that the nature of growth of productivity today is more wasteful in human terms than its potential. And the nature of the innovation itself is less for humanity in general. So, the three aspects, therefore, of decline, which I refer to, are the increasing difficulty in finding mediations for existing, decline in the law of value, and the limits on productivity. To that one has to add, very obviously, the position today with which I'll end, and that is what's actually happening, the structural crisis of capitalism. It is paradoxical that capitalism has managed to maintain itself precisely through the existence of transitional forms like that of the Soviet Union, but it has managed to do it. It has actually worked. Earlier I was arguing that the complexity of society makes it difficult to understand it, but it also directly has given an opportunity for capitalism to avoid a structural crisis. Now, I'll go back to it tomorrow, but it's clearly done that. That's to say, the Cold War was crucial to the stability of capitalism in the post-war period. You no longer have a Cold War. The wars you have now are relatively unimportant. So, logically, we're back to the structural crisis of capitalism. We're back to the point, which I'll begin with tomorrow, really, that capitalism is in a similar crisis which it was in 1929, or if you want from 1917. We're back to where it was, precisely because the Soviet Union has come to an end. The failure of the Soviet Union, effectively, no longer is able to maintain capitalism, paradoxically, but is no longer able to do that. So capitalism is back to its old structural crisis. That is where we are. That doesn't mean to say that capitalism will be overthrown. It simply means that in its decline, its structural crisis continues. Of course, now what's been talked about is stagnation, about which we'll talk about tomorrow. Thank you. First, in relation to Tony, yes, I agree with what you've said. I did define decline in three ways, which I repeated several times. I suppose you can criticise the way I did it. I thought I'd begin with an introduction before I went into it. But yes, I mean, I can't disagree with much of what you said. What crucially you said was that what was critical in Britain was that it was part of the global system, and that proportion of global surplus value was coming to Britain, which was helping to finance it. I think that's true. There's no question that Britain was and is an imperialist power. And you gave the example of Chinese goods. It's absolutely true, but of course it's more than that. Britain is a finance capitalist power, and so it's doing precisely that. And that's absolutely true. I don't disagree. I was using Britain as an example of the world economy, but one could apply it to the world economy as a whole if you want. And the same would actually apply, but of course there'd be differences between countries. But nonetheless, the same tendency exists throughout the world. So your point is right, but I don't think it alters my general view or what I basically said, except that perhaps I should have said that. In relation to what Anne brought up, so again, I was taking Britain because we live in Britain, and so it's an obvious way to understand it. Of course, Britain is not the only country with a national health centre, maybe slightly different in Germany or France or various other countries on the continent. It's true in the United States, of course, that it's privatised, but what you don't have is simply doctors on their own who simply have to be paid begin and end of it. You go into a hospital, you have an operation, it costs you whatever, $100,000, and you write a check for $100,000. Very few people can actually do that. So it is socialised in a different way. That's to say, you have insurance companies doing it. The doctors are subject to the insurance companies. So you have in effect a monopoly form, which itself is governed to a degree, now more governed by the state. So it is different from Britain, but it's nonetheless, you can call it a more complex form of interaction between state and market, or between monopoly forms and market. It clearly isn't simply governed by the law of value. The law of value is involved, but that doesn't end it. You know, when a doctor or a surgeon has to phone up the insurance company to see whether he should operate or shouldn't operate, well, you know, what exactly is that? And it isn't as if the insurance company, which of course will be considering the money involved, is simply one capitalist sitting there just thinking, okay, if I allow this operation to happen, it'll cost me so much, the guy dies, well, so what? I've made the money. He can't do that. So it's an interaction between the law of value and needs which is going on there. It's true that it's not the same as the NHS, but it is a partially socialised form. You can't simply say that it's simply surplus value. It's clearly more limited than that. And of course it's changing. They're obviously going to be forced to turn it eventually into a government-run system. Regarding the pharmaceutical companies, yes, they are making a considerable amount of money, though pharmaceutical companies are a very good example of the way capitalism itself is changing. In order for them to produce a new medicine, a new drug, it takes them many, many years. And you know, they employ a very large number of researchers, and so far as they don't, they use the research in the universities, in governments effectively. So you have really a socialised within capitalism form of research, because research itself takes a very long time. Once they've actually got a drug, as you know, it takes them something like 10 years to get the drug to the market. So it's very, very long lead times. They require enormous levels of capital for them to do it. And of course, the result of this is that they are failing in the task of providing medicines. Because as you know, they will not try and provide medicines for malaria, for all the diseases of the poor. They just avoid doing it because they aren't going to make any money on it. So it's a very good example of how capitalism, as it were, isn't able to raise productivity in particular ways, or just can't enter it. It's just leaving it one side. While on the other hand, it's very long term. You have to have very large levels of capital, and government has to be involved one way or another, because they are very often dependent on the universities or government grants or whatever, even in the most privatized countries. The question of the laws of nature. Well, I don't know. I dare say we won't be able to control the cosmos. Not that we actually know what the cosmos is. But
it's a magazine sent to women.
Okay. But what we're able to do in a very small way now is employ certain of the laws of nature in our own interest, and as far as we can, actually bend them to our own interest. And if one thinks of what is potentially possible, you can think of 101 ways in which things could happen. We don't actually know where we're going to get, where the world will be in 1,000 years' time, but the degree of control over our own lives, which it implies, over society, is clearly enormous. And it would involve us understanding and actually using the laws of nature, and possibly even altering it in our own. I don't see how you can avoid that. We're already doing it in relation to ourselves. Mankind will be humanity will be very different, simply as entities in a few hundred years' time, given the fact that the various parts within our bodies can be replaced, can be improved, perhaps even abolished and replaced something completely different. I think we are talking of an increasing degree of control over our environment and ultimately over some of the aspects of the laws of nature, yes. The first point was raised by Ben, in which he said that one really ought to look at the debates in Germany around the beginning of the 20th century. I think that's probably true. Well, it's clear that there were discussions about the coming to an end of capitalism. That's not the same thing as decline, of course. There would have to be such discussions if they were socialist parties, obviously. You're talking of the end of capitalism, the beginning of socialism. But it's not there as a declining period. It's much more like what you talked about, absolute collapse. It was one possibility. That was one particular theory of it. It's true, they're discussing it that way, but that just isn't decline. It's also true, as you pointed out, that in Marx you do have a theory of crisis, of course. And he did think that capitalism could have come to an end, not just in 1948, in 1857, because of the 1857 crisis. So it's true that within Marx there is a theory of how the system is coming to an end, not just a prediction, but an overall theory of crisis, which obviously we are using all the time, and would be part of a more general theory of decline, if you want, but it would have to be integrated into a theory of decline. Well, I think it is. But you're right, one ought to look more at the discussions of that time. However, having said that, Lenin's theory of decline comes about because of the war, effectively, trying to explain the war. The war itself is a symptom of decline. Imperialism is a symptom of decline. I only mention them at the end because I've repeated that 100 times. I think it gets boring. Not just for me, but for you just to hear me repeating it. But so it's not really surprising that it should be at that time. But it's not just 1917 or 16 when he actually writes it. It's that the Russian Revolution itself takes place, which changes the world, followed by its defeat by Stalinism, which then requires an overall theory of decline combined with transition, as it were. And that, of course, did not exist. And you wouldn't expect it to exist in an earlier period. That doesn't alter the point that one ought to look at that and see what's there. The question of war, what you're effectively saying is that capitalism can recoup and go to war again. Well, there's only one country which can really go to any war which is of any great importance, as opposed to minor wars or. I don't know whom Britain will fight next, but it's hard to see. Britain isn't going to fight France, obviously.
Whoever America fights.
Yeah, whoever America fights. The junior partner. Well, there really is a problem there, isn't there? At the moment, the United States does not have a call-up. It doesn't have conscription. And they're afraid to do it. And if you look at what happened last time, That was the last time in the 60s and early 70s, of course, there were massive protests. They did radicalize the population. Students turned to the far left. The far left groups grew enormously. The Trotskyist movement grew very substantially. Now, they know it will repeat itself. It can't do anything else. Who on earth wants to kill himself for no good reason? Okay, they can go as a matter of propaganda, but for what? And for what? Well, why are you going to? Who are you going to fight? What's the cause? At least in the case of Vietnam, they had a story to tell as to why they were there. What's the cause today? Who are you fighting for? Why? Yeah, they can dream up whatever it is. Death is final. Nobody wants it. Least of all, people who've got the whole life in front of them, because obviously they're not going to send out people who are 50 and 60. So people are just not going to accept it. They know that, which is why they didn't go to another war until the present one. The present war is minor. They know the number of people involved is relatively small compared to what they had before. What, there were 50,000 deaths in Vietnam? How many are there? 3,000 in the United States at the moment. So it's minor by comparison. Not that one cannot do anything but condemn it, but it's minor by comparison. It's very hard to see how on earth they're going to mobilize the population to go to war today. Okay, I can't really say what will happen in 50 years' time, but it's very hard to see it. And we know that they were afraid to go to war after Vietnam. Bush managed to do it. In fact, he only just managed to do it, really. The bourgeoisie was actually against going to war. So, a substantial section of it. So, I just don't believe that it'll be on the cards for some time to come. Maybe in 30, 40 years, I don't know. I just don't know what will happen then. Assuming capitalism is sufficiently vibrant to actually do it. It's true that when we're talking of capitalism, we talk first and foremost of its dominant country, the finance capitalist country which is dominant. I haven't gone over finance capitalism again because I have spoken at these seminars at Communist University about it several times. But the finance capitalist country which controls is the country of capitalism, and that is the United States and remains such. And it's obvious the United States is in decline itself. Its decline is automatically the decline of capitalism. It's hard to see under those circumstances how it's going to act to go to war. Remember, part of the aspect of why we don't get wars is that you can't actually throw the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb is the end of war at one level. If you actually throw it, not only will the other side lose, you lose. It's pointless doing it. And they know it very well, which is why they never did it against Russia or Russia against it. So you can't really use the thing. But it's not just atomic warfare. The whole nature of the weapons involved have become so gross, in fact, so socialized, it's very hard to use large sections which have been outlawed. I can't use gas warfare. Okay, Saddam Hussein could use gas warfare, but the United States can't. They can't use germ warfare. They may build it up, but they can't actually use it. It'd be the obvious thing to use if they really wanted to win a war, but they actually have outlawed it because of the obviously more general effects of it. So even artillery today is such that they could simply wipe out whole countries very, very quickly. And again, they didn't do that to Iraq. They could have done it. They didn't. It's the result of this socialization of warfare itself. It's the result of the enormous productivity and the innovation in the nature of weapons. The logic of it is that will continue. The logic of it is that effectively you end up in a position where if you go to war, you can very easily destroy the world. Why go to war? But even that's just one aspect. The other, which as it were is both pessimistic and optimistic. But the other aspect is simply that in the United States the experience is such that it's hard for them to go for another period of conscription. It's just not believable. It's not believable anyway in the next 10 years. So I don't think that would be a way out, but I find it very hard to see it. Right. This is not the same thing as the overall discussion of decline, I suppose. This is something else which we're going to discuss tomorrow. Mike has effectively dealt with the question of productive and unproductive. There's a clear difference between the production of wealth, which applies to whoever is engaged in one way or another with the society and economy. So in that sense, a teacher is producing wealth, a lecturer is producing wealth, civil servants producing wealth. That doesn't alter the fact that if they're not producing profit, they are not productive. But what that is saying is they're not productive within the capitalist system. They are not producing profit. That's quite different from producing wealth. Mike's right that it was Adam Smith, of course, who introduced the distinction between productive and unproductive. However much the right might like Adam Smith, they hate that aspect. Adam Smith's conception, though, is not the same as that of Marx. Adam Smith's conception is that whatever is good for accumulation is productive. Whatever is not good for accumulation, like the example of the monk, is no good, is unproductive. And that would mean, and that's what we usually already talking about, that the servants that the aristocracy or the rising bourgeoisie had were unproductive. That's what he's referring to in particular. What he's anxious to do is to develop capital itself and get away from an earlier form of capitalism effect. So he therefore says that services are unproductive. And if you read any of the texts, and I have actually written a paper on this, which is why I'm able to talk about it now, the relationship between Adam Smith and Marx and productive and unproductive labour. So if you read Adam Smith, he actually does say basically that services are unproductive. Now, Marx does not say that, and Marx has really brought it out very well. Marx is very clear there's no distinction between goods and services. Services are as productive as production of goods. There's no reason why there should be any distinction from this point of view. Marx also takes the example of the circus clown who is productive, working for a circus, which are not usually run by the state. So we're talking of circuses who are making money. And he also takes the example of the teacher. The teacher who works for profit is productive. The one who does not is unproductive. But of course, today the number of private tutors is somewhat limited, and the position, of course, is that it has to be done by the society as a whole, by the state. It can't be done it really can't be done by anybody else successfully. That doesn't alter the fact that they are trying to introduce various forms of it. And while I agree with Mike, I think the question is actually quite complex, very complex, because just consider what we no longer have in the same way with privatization, but just consider a nationalized company like British Leyland. Well, it was nationalized. Now, a worker is working for a firm which, after all, is making a profit. Well, making a loss. I mean, no one's making a loss. All right, making negative profit. Okay, now, is that worker productive or unproductive? It's not a simple answer. I think one has to refer to both aspects of it, and this is part of what I was referring to when I was saying that it becomes complex and the laws begin to conflict. I think one has to answer, if even within the state sector, that if it's based on profit, then it is productive. One can't avoid that, because if it's based on profit. On the other hand, Mike's point also is right. I didn't stress the importance of the state. Again, it's part of it. I've said it so often that I thought it was obvious, but you're right, I should have said much more about it. And I agree with Mike, of course. The state plays an important role. And in that particular example, it isn't so simple as saying that it is making a profit, because, of course, the state is interfering. It did interfere with British Leyland. And if it actually would have made a profit, they would have simply taken part of it for itself, which is what they tended to do with the other nationalised industries, say the electricity industry, was often stunted in countries where it's controlled by the state, because the state takes the profits in order to maintain their activities in other sectors. So it then becomes sort of both yes and no. Yes, it's productive, but on the other hand, it is not productive. I think one can't avoid that point. It simply becomes an answer which you can't just say yes. You have to say yes, but, or yes and perhaps not, and so on. But if you purely have a state enterprise which is purely based on profit, the state doesn't take money out of it as the state, quite apart from taxes, then of course I don't see why you wouldn't call it productive. Because it's based on profit, it's based on surplus value, workers are selling the labour power. Yeah, the only difference is that it's officially owned by it, but the state isn't interfering. In practice, the state always does interfere, so it's never that clear cut. Otherwise, you have to go along the lines of Margaret Thatcher, who did argue that whatever the state held was unproductive. If you remember, that was her line, that we had to reduce the state to zero, which presumably may well be the view of the present government. I'm not clear exactly where they think they're getting that viewpoint from. I agree with Mike with most of what he's saying. When you're talking about China, it actually is the case that all important firms in the end are owned by the state. In the special economic zones, I think the foreign firms can have 55% of equity. The implication, nonetheless, is the state is involved everywhere. What you call it is another matter. You call it market Stalinism, if you want, or something like that. It's clearly not simply capitalism. But it's, I think Mike is right, it is part of this overall decline, or of a world in decline, or a world in transition. The advantage of what the Chinese have done, of course, is that the state can't be accused of throwing people out of work, because nominally at least it appears to be some owner, some millionaire Chinese owner, or foreign firms which are actually doing it. The firm is simply working apparently on profit. Consequently, they have to blame capital. But of course, it doesn't quite work like that, because obviously the Chinese know that in the end this state is involved. And we've seen examples where the state has had to retreat, where a particular firm, remember, wanted to close down, and workers struck and so on. The state intervened and retreated. So again, it's both aspects which are there, and the Chinese, I'm sure, are increasingly conscious of the real position of where they are. Thanks. Well, it's a very large subject, and I deliberately decided that I would give a slightly different talk to the ones I've given here before, as a result of which I've stressed certain aspects and de-stressed or left out aspects which I've referred to, or which I could have spent much more time on, like on finance, capital, or the role of the state. But partly because I assume that most people have heard me, and partly because by now I've said it so often I'm bored by it. But one aspect, of course, is the role of abstract labour, which is in the article, at least in an article I've written on it. And because it follows that if the law of value is declining, so must abstract labour. And we spent a long time on that. But if that is the case, then the basis of the working class as a class changes. And therefore the nature of the struggle itself begins to change. I think the way out of it is to argue that increasingly the struggle becomes political. And that's to say workers are going up on the scale, and that if they are in enterprises controlled by the state or government or administration, then they can see directly their forms of exploitation. Having said that, it's a very long discussion, so I'll just leave it at that point, rather tantalizingly. And go on to the next point, which seems to be around war. Well, of course I agree with Ted, as I've already said, I think war is very unlikely. Behind that, in theoretical terms, is certainly a difference with Mike on this, because I don't agree that there's any alternative to the United States. I don't think Germany will be forced into anything. What has happened has been an international division of labour in which Germany has become perhaps even the prime industrial nation. It's certainly true if you have a choice of cars, you'll buy a German car. You aren't going to buy a French car. You'd be mad to buy a car made in Britain. So you're kind of stuck with buying in Germany. You certainly wouldn't buy an American car. But that doesn't alter the point. The dominance present at the present time remains with finance capitalist power. It's not simply a kind of evolution with war in the background. It's an evolution in the nature of capital itself, that it's switched or moved on to finance capital as a form of control, which has been highly successful, as it were. And it began in the 1870s. It has managed to implode somewhat, and particular strategies we're going to talk about tomorrow can't be continued in the previous form. But that doesn't alter the fact that it remains to some degree under control now. Germany is not going to become a finance capitalist power. It tried it, it failed. And it was trying to do it before now. It didn't get anywhere. You've got Deutsche Bank, all right. Deutsche Bank put its shares into a separate company. They're still in that separate company. They still haven't actually sold them off. You would have thought they would sold them off. There might have been something else, but still there. They are not a finance capitalist power. In fact, they are a finance capitalist sufferer. That's about all you can say. The banks were caught. There's no way it can possibly be a competitor to the United States. Even today, the United States industrially remains the major capitalist power. It's true that Germany, in certain respects, is superior, but overall, there's no competitor for Intel other than AMD, which isn't really a competitor, and that's America. You can just go through it. Look at the pharmaceutical companies. Okay, you've got Glaxo, but I think the chairman of Glaxo lives in America. You've got a number of Swiss companies, but again, you see where they're actually selling it to. America, to answer. It can't alter. Switzerland's got 5 million people. They can't sell to 5 million people all their drugs. They have to sell to Americans. 300 million Americans, after all. And it's a wealthy country, so they are going to buy the drugs, even if it's only going to be the rich people. There are enough of them. So it's hard to see how there can be any competitor. If anybody thinks the euro or the eurozone is going to be a competitor, they must have lost that idea in this current year. It's obvious that the eurozone isn't going to be any competitor in that sense. It's hard to imagine it even in 20 years. At the moment, it looks as if it's more or less knocked out, and all you've got basically is Germany and the region around it. So it doesn't seem to me that is likely, but there's a more fundamental reason behind that. I think what one's talking about is decline, and with decline, disintegration. That's to say, regarded as another stage within the actual decline. When you've got an overarching power like the United States, in one sense it has united the world. It's united the world economically, it's united the world against it, if you want, as well. But it has united the world. What is happening is that it is in decline. It's because capitalism is directly in decline, and it's because the stabilizing force of capitalism, which was World War, which was the Cold War, and what Stalinism is no longer there. The transition period, in other words, is really asking to come to an end. We put it like that. John rightly referred to Engels, who talks of the invading social society. It is knocking at the door. It's hard to see any other form. The logic of this is disintegration. Just as the Soviet Union disintegrated, it's still disintegrating, and Putin's doing his best to keep it together, but still disintegrating. So, what's trying to do, well, you can see it is disintegrating. You can see how on the borders the fighting is going on, and the bushfires, in fact, are a reflection of it too. The world, in that sense, will disintegrate, or rather, one has a force of disintegration at work. It's not the only force. You still have the United States as the major capitalist power. Finance capital remains. But as it goes down, one would expect the unity, the control, the centralized control to disintegrate with it, which is what is obviously happening. It's not an accident that the Eurozone is in trouble, or the United States is fighting wars, which I think Ted's absolutely right. It can't control it. There is no way it can now just invade Africa or some country in Africa and expect to leave it okay from their point of view. It just can't be done any longer. The fact that in South America you've got these regimes which we obviously don't support, but nonetheless, or what do you call it, social democratic or nationalist or whatever, is a reflection of declining American power. But what then? There's no other power that can replace it. America replaced Britain, but there's no other power. You don't have another country which has 300 million. You don't have another power which has the economic forms, size, wealth of the United States. There is no other possibility. Mike says it'll force it. Nobody's going to force Germany to do it. And the Eurozone, it just isn't going to go anywhere. So there isn't anything else. You talk of China, we've talked about it before, we had a discussion about it, but it's clear that China is dependent on the United States. It's not the other way around. It's selling to the United States is investing in it, and in fact the very Communist Party structure is clearly being supported by the United States. The United States, if it wanted to, could begin to do what it's doing to Iran, support the various national groupings. But in fact, when you had minor revolts, it didn't do anything. It could easily do it. It could ask Taiwan to act. It's not doing it. It's supporting China. It's a direct deal. The idea that they're competing is ridiculous. They are one entity, effectively, China and the United States today. The amount of investment in the United States is colossal. From their point of view, when China invests in Africa, it's the United States investing in Africa itself. Because they are getting, the materials go to China, they export it to America. It's a much easier form because the United States can't actually do that without people objecting in Africa. Whereas the African countries prefer the Chinese from that point of view. Though from other points of view, they may not like them because they are often worse taskmasters. But because they are Chinese and not American, they're more acceptable. So the idea that China will be some superpower is absurd. I mean, only nutcases like, what was this group?
Martin Jakes as well.
Yeah, couldn't ever think of it. Even though it will be have a GDP bigger than the United States, you just look at the GDP per head. It's somewhere right down there. You look at the number of people who just about manage to live in China, the proportion who remain on farms. So we are. You could even look at the productivity. I mean, you gave the example last time of your computer. It's certainly true. When I bought Chinese goods, there's always been something wrong. I'm sure that's not always true, but I have looked at the figures, and there's no question that its productivity even in the best case, working in a firm based on profits, using the most modern equipment, is below that of the United States. So there's no way it is a real competitor to the United States. It's not an accident the United States hasn't done very much, in spite of all the moaning that go on about the imports. So what one's talking about isn't that there will be another superpower. That will not happen. I think we're talking about much more disintegration as a further phase, given the ending of the Soviet Union. Stalinization of the Soviet Union was a wonderful gift to capitalism. They couldn't have had anything better. Of course, they helped it happen, but they took advantage of it, and it did delay the possibility of moving to socialism. It's no longer there. It may take some time before the world recuperates from that, but that's the way it's going. And at the moment, in the absence of a socialist force, I think we'll talk about it again tomorrow, the movement is towards disintegration rather than anything else. And I would add, we should talk about it tomorrow, and probably an increasing degree of authoritarian rule in the developed countries. Thank you.